of City Planning. The charter mission of the department is very simple. It's to plan for the future of New York City. It does have a number of strategic objectives, catalyzing long-term neighborhood improvements through integrated planning and targeted accompanying public investments. And if that sounds like a mouthful and a little confusing, that just means any investments that might be needed to carry out that long-term planning, to pay for it, essentially. Encourage housing production, affordability, and quality, promoting economic development, job growth, enhancing resiliency and sustainability of neighborhoods. And then these last two are kind of a little more process, ensuring integrity, timeliness, and responsiveness in land use reviews, which I'll explain what that is in a bit, and then supplying objective data and expertise to a broad range of planning functions and stakeholders. So just a point of interest, the Department of City Planning, the central office, is located in a building at 120 Broadway. This is in Lower Manhattan. You can see the Brooklyn Bridge towards the top of the screen there. This building looks pretty innocuous in its context today. A lot of tall buildings have grown up around it. But one of those small ironies of where things end up, the Department of City Planning moved into this building in 2016. This is the building, when it was first built, that sparked the country's first zoning resolution, the 1916 New York City zoning resolution. Not because people thought this was a great building, but because people were terrified of the shadows cast by this building. There were descriptions of 7-acre shadows at certain times of day being cast by it. And so, ironically, the Department of City Planning is now headquartered in the building that really gave rise to the need for the Department of City Planning. But it's a beautiful building, and it doesn't seem so overwhelming today. I guess things change. For those of you who aren't so familiar with the history of planning as it relates to New York City, I would just point out that on the left here are some famous Hugh Ferris sketches from the 1920s, where he went about stepwise going through what would actually be created per the zoning resolution. So in the upper left-hand corner, you get the kind of shard building that if you literally interpreted the setbacks in the resolution, you would get that. And then in the lower right-hand corner, what you would get typically. And so this creates a lot of the very iconic wedding cake buildings that we see throughout the city. You can kind of see one here, actually, which looks like a late 50s, early 60s building that might have come in just before the new zoning resolution in 1961. So the Department of City Planning is a pretty big department, I think, comparative to some maybe other municipalities in the country. It's about 300 employees. I think it's a little less now. We've lost some members through attrition, and probably like a lot of other municipal offices in the country, hiring freeze, so we hadn't been able to bring new people on. But it's usually about 300 people. It sounds like a lot, but I'll just put it in context by saying the city of New York has about 300,000 employees that work for the municipality, and so we constitute about 0.1%. The Department of Health, for instance, has 7,000 employees, so it's a much bigger department. But we are a pretty big department, and that allows us to do a lot. I put up some of the major breakdowns. Exhaustive, we have other groups, but I think maybe for this presentation, these are the most interesting. We have our strategic divisions, which include transportation, urban design, waterfront and open space, housing and economic development, population and regional planning. Then we have our borough offices. So each of the city's 5 boroughs has its own office. And then we have our land use review division, which is really responsible for the technical review of proposed land use changes, environmental review, working with the planners that shepherd those projects through the process. So there's a specific group dedicated to that I would say has been performing very well during the pandemic. They got us up and running pretty quickly to start commission presentations and all of that again. So those are the basic large breakdowns. I couldn't talk about the Department of City Planning without talking about our zoning resolution. The maintenance of the zoning resolution is a critical component of our chartered mandated work. So this is something we're responsible for. We don't enforce the zoning resolution, that's the Department of Buildings, but we are the ones that modify it, that update it, that help to interpret it when perhaps a DOB has a question or there's a point of confusion. We're lucky that we have a special division focused just on this. Our zoning resolution is quite complicated. It's over 1,000 pages. It's essentially a legal document. And so we have a whole group of planners, I believe about 10 or 15 of them in our downtown office, fluctuates, that dedicate themselves to really just understanding in minute detail what is actually in the resolution. Zoning, for those of you that maybe haven't gotten to this aspect in your classes yet, or just are curious how it works in New York City, it's pretty typical. It tells you where you can build and what you can build. Tells you how tall, for instance, something can be built, how much space needs to be set aside for side yards, rear yards, that sort of thing. I apologize for any noise. I'm facing a concrete courtyard, and when people are out there talking, it tends to echo, so apologize if you're getting a lot of background noise. When the building tells us when the building needs to step back to let in light and air. So even though we don't necessarily have the wedding cake provisions from the 1916 zoning resolution anymore, we still have provisions for setbacks and things like that. It includes special district rules. So these are instances where, for certain reasons, a decision has been made that there should be special rules that apply, and a lot of other things. What you see on the right-hand side is a much friendlier interpretation of the zoning resolution that was also put together by our zoning division. This is kind of part of our public outreach work. We put together a zoning handbook. It's still fairly technical, but it's a lot more approachable for people. And it's not as exhaustive and as detailed, and you would have to look into the zoning resolution itself if you're going to build something, but this at least helps you get a footing. And I can say most of us in the agency have our copy of the zoning handbook on hand because questions come up all the time, and it is, again, quite complex and long. I've also chosen this image because the one building on the upper left-hand corner is right around the corner from me right now, and it's, I think, one of the better examples of dormers and kind of these new buildings that have gone up. So other functions of the Department of City Planning. One of our functions that was one of our strategic objectives is to supply objective data and expertise to a broad range of planning functions and stakeholders. I think we do this really well. We have a particular division in our downtown office, which is kind of its own thing, called Planning Labs, and it's staffed by very skilled programmers who put together products like these websites here that are accessible to the public, and they really give people a lot of control over their access to information. They bring a lot of disparate sources of information together. So on the left is the Zoning and Land Use Information Portal, known as ZOLA, not to be confused with the ZOLA wedding site, which we also see lots of ads for on the subway here. This lets you go in, click on any parcel, understand what zoning applies to that parcel, understand size, ownership. There are links that take you back to all of the certificates of occupancy, going back to when they originated. You can really dig up a lot of information really quickly. And then on the right, just as an example, is our community district profiles. So the City of New York has 59 community districts. These are smaller geographies with community boards that have advisory roles, and but the geographies themselves are geographies people are familiar with, and so it's helpful for people to be able to pull all kinds of demographic and land use information or whatever they might be looking for. We're also very frequently a resource for sister agencies doing work that might have less capacity. DCP is sort of known as functioning essentially as an agency of consultants, and by that I mean we very rarely issue RFPs for consultant work. It's very rare that we would do that. We have a large team and we're able to do a lot in-house, and we tend to do it in-house. And sometimes that means also helping our agency, so we effectively work as consultants to fellow agencies. So this is a book that was put together for the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, called Connected Communities, that was just issued at the beginning of this year. And it was looking at all of the NYCHA campuses in the city across a number of issue areas for recommendations, improvements that could be made. NYCHA is the largest landlord in the city of New York. There are about 400,000 New Yorkers that live in NYCHA housing. Unlike a lot of American cities, New York City never really demolished any of its public housing. There are still very large campuses all over the city. There are significant issues with them. Part of this book was helping think through how some of that might be improved. But you can see some of the work that was done here, really beautiful work by our urban design division in collaboration with some others. And then just a point, because, give you a sense of the size of New York and the sorts of things New York kind of has to worry about, a lot of kinds of issues. Coastal resiliency, I mentioned because this recently came before the commission, and this is a fairly big deal for the future of the city. The city of New York has about 520 miles of coastline throughout the 5 boroughs. This is quite a bit, obviously. Every year, actually, not this year, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, but every year on the 20th of May, there are a series of walks that the department organizes. So members of the community or whoever wants to can go to various points throughout the city and walk with people who are knowledgeable about the coastline there and have a conversation. It's generally a very successful thing. I think the point here is that 20% of the city's land area is in the floodplain, and this translates to nearly 800,000 people. And so the city has been, really since Hurricane Sandy, thinking a lot about what this means for where and how the city grows and how it builds back if it can, and really trying to protect the city and make the city more resilient leading up to 2050. This, I would say, if anyone is interested, you could Google this and find a commission presentation that was given by my colleague Manuela about a month ago. Very well done. That really steps through in detail what this is about. So I just talked a lot about our central divisions. I'd like to talk a little bit about our borough divisions, because I myself am a borough planner. I'm stationed in the Bronx office. I spend about half of any given week, or used to, when we weren't working from home, I would spend about half of any given week in Lower Manhattan at the 120 Broadway, but would oftentimes spend much of my time up at our office in the Bronx. Borough planners are sort of entirely separate set, because we do sort of different things than the downtown planners. One of the primary roles that we have is as a liaison to community boards and to the borough. So as I said, there are 59 community boards. There are 12 in the Bronx. Each borough planner is assigned to a community board. We're a little short on staff right now, so a couple of us are doubled up on community boards. But what we do is we go to the board. The board is an entity that was created in 1975, these community boards, to weigh in on different processes, including our land use process, but also they get involved with community budget requests. So they issue community board budget requests every year. They're actually going through that process right now, which guides the city in investing and where to invest and what priority investments are. So our role is to liaise with them, to go to their meetings, attend their meetings, to serve as, again, essentially sort of consultants to them when they have questions or needs, or maybe need help sussing out aspects of the zoning resolution or whatever it might be. So John, who's the head of my board, CB3, will frequently call up with questions if maybe a developer comes to him and he wants to make sure he can understand what the developer is proposing, that sort of thing. Second important role that I won't spend too much time on is to shepherd land use applications through the land use process. So, everyone has a legal right to file a zoning change application in the city. Those go through what's called our uniform land use review procedure process. And as borough planners, those projects that come through the borough are divvied up among the planners, and we make sure everything is in good shape. We are impartial when we get to the public portion of it, but there's a lot of work initially to push any designs that come through in the right direction to make sure the right kind of public benefits are being thought about. Borough planners tend to understand much better than the development teams that come in what the needs are of the community, have a sense of requests that have come up previously, whether through public outreach or meetings or that sort of thing. So we try to push those teams in the right direction. And then maybe the most exciting, and I would say for me, the portion of our work that most closely corresponds to how I always imagined maybe working for a city might be, which is we carry out borough-specific planning studies. So just really quickly about the Bronx, because it is the borough where I work. The Bronx is a very unique place. It's also a very big place comparatively. There are 1.4 million residents in the Bronx. It's nearly the size of Philadelphia itself. It's the only borough entirely on the U.S. mainland. It's New York City's only majority Hispanic borough, and the Spanish is very, very prevalent in the West Bronx. It tends to be a little different maybe than the Midwest, very Caribbean accented here. We have a very large historic population from Puerto Rico, but an even larger now population from the Dominican Republic. It's also, I would say, diverse in many other ways. There's a growing West African population in the borough, in the West Bronx in particular. You go up to Riverdale, you have a very large a Russian population, or you will also likely hear a lot of Hebrew in that area. You go over to the East Bronx, you have the city's fastest growing Bengali population, a very large and growing Albanian population, pretty much anything you could want. And in fact, the U.S. Census Bureau has, at least at one point, considered the Bronx to be the single most diverse place in the country. I think their measure was something, if you were to take any two people at random in the borough, there was a 90 or an 89% chance that they would be of a different race or ethnicity. So it's very interesting. And about a third of the borough is an immigrant population. So it's very new in many ways, and had been growing. We'll see what happens here. But it does have a lot of issues, and those include poverty. It is the poorest borough by far in the city, with a median household income in around $36,000, I believe. And it has easily the poorest health metrics of all the 5 boroughs. So there are a lot of challenges. Some of those health metrics are correlated to poverty and effects of poverty. Some of them are correlated to the history of planning, to be quite frank, in the borough. Robert Moses has a very, very heavy fingerprint on the borough. I'll step through that a little bit. Not all of it is bad, but a lot of it was pretty devastating, such as the Cross Bronx. Just quickly, this image you see here, if anyone is interested, this is the Grand Concourse that runs through the Bronx. It runs all the way from the south end of the borough, all the way to Mosholu Parkway near the very north end of the borough. It was built to be the Champs-Élysées of the Bronx, and it is home to the country's largest concentration of Art Deco apartment buildings. There aren't too many in this, but in the background there were some. This isn't the history of the East Bronx, or the Bronx in general. I could go on for a long time, but I would say that the Bronx was historically a bedroom community. It was very well connected. It was actually the first outer area beyond Manhattan to be connected to Manhattan before consolidation, when all the boroughs consolidated and became New York City in 1898. The Bronx was actually ahead of it by about 20 years. It was, if you look in old maps, it's called the annexed district of the Bronx. So it feels much more of a piece of Manhattan than maybe some of the other outer boroughs, very dense. Okay. So neighborhood studies. I said neighborhood studies are a very exciting part of what we do in the borough offices. So I just wanted to give a little context on sort of what's driving this. So Mayor de Blasio, who has been our mayor, he's coming to the end of his 2nd term now. He had set as a goal in Housing New York the goal of creating or preserving 300,000 units of affordable housing. So this is a tall order. It came at a time when certainly the city was booming and growing, and there were increasing concerns about displacement and so forth. So in 2015, the city issued put into place its mandatory inclusionary housing policy, which is a legal requirement that's embedded in the zoning resolution. And essentially what it requires is that in any instance where the zoning, so what is allowed to be built on a piece of property, changes such that it allows housing where previously no housing was allowed, or such that it allows a significant increase in housing over the housing that was already allowed, the city can require that a mandatory inclusionary housing area, so it's just literally a map, gets mapped for that rezoning area, so they coincide, can be mapped. And what that means is that anything built on that property has to provide 20 to 30% of the units as permanently affordable. Development teams enter into agreements with the city's Housing and Preservation Development Division. And those will never roll out. The affordability levels, it's a little complex. They range from 30 to 130% of area median income. There are criticisms certainly of the program that maybe it hasn't performed the way it should have, but it is currently in place at the primary way that the city is seeking to provide affordable housing by leveraging some of the private market activity that had been happening in the city. The map that you see there is just some of the initial studies that were identified under de Blasio Some of these have gone through. Some of them faltered in the public review process, whether it was because of council member opposition or for other reasons, and some of them are still ongoing. These are multi-year efforts, these studies. They often take many years. They involve a lot of community engagement of different kinds, a lot of agency coordination. The Department of City Planning, as the agency tasked with planning for the city, part of our work means, getting DOT in a room, getting parks in a room, reaching agreement on how things can be advanced that are identified as priorities by communities in planning studies. Identifying funds is always a priority. The city has established what's called a neighborhood development fund. So DCP, this is important, is a mayoral agency, so we answer to the mayor, so we're responsible to him. We also answer to the City Planning Commission. It happens to be the case that the mayor appoints the chair of the City Planning Commission, who is herself the ex officio head of the Department of City Planning. So obviously the mayor's priorities drive a lot of work. And because these studies were a priority and it was acknowledged that in order for DCP as a non-capital agency to have leverage with capital agencies, it was important that we had a dedicated pot of funds that we could essentially use as capital funds and provide capital agencies in the event that projects were identified as priorities. And so, for instance, in the Jerome Avenue study that you see on the left there were a number of parks improvements that were identified, and the Department of City Planning was able to provide funds to the Parks Department so that they could then build those. Whereas had we not had those funds, it would have been a lot more difficult. The Parks Department, has their priorities, their budgets. It makes the work a bit easier, and it makes it easier to work with our sister agencies on those. And then I would just say, as a general rule, the studies do have as an important form of implementation among all the others rezonings. And the reason there is really that nexus with the mandatory inclusionary housing, where essentially, for reasons that it would essentially be a taking, we can't just require mandatory inclusionary housing, obviously, on a property without giving something in exchange. And also, typically, those properties can actually get a little bit more of a bump, even from what, as long as they're doing mandatory inclusionary housing, from what even the zoning change would allow them to do. That's a lot of detail. I'm happy to answer questions on that, but I think that probably gives you an idea of DCP and how it's structured. I'll pause there in case there are any questions and just see how I'm doing on time, and then I'll jump into the Bronx Metro North study. Okay, here are no questions, so I'll keep plugging away. The Bronx Metro North, oops, two norths there, apologies, station area study. A little bit of context. This study is part of a larger set of projects that the Metropolitan Transportation Authority is pursuing, known as Penn Station Access, which ties to East Side Access. I'm not going to get into the details, but there's a lot of train work that need to be done to ship trains that go into Grand Central or Penn Station or whatnot. And what this will facilitate that work eventually is allowing Metro North Railroad, which is one of 3 regional rail operators in the metropolitan region, the other 2 being Long Island Railroad, which services Long Island, and New Jersey Transit. So Metro North had previously identified as a priority they wanted to add stations in the East Bronx. There are no stations today in the East Bronx. There are Acela trains, which are the high-speed trains that run between Boston and DC that run along this line, but there are no stops there. There are also some freight trains that run along the line. So the line exists, but there are no stations. So the MTA had identified this as an opportunity. There are good reasons to put stations here. There's a need. There are 500,000 Bronx residents within 1 mile of the stations, so huge population. There are numerous jobs and population centers along the line to the north, and there are quarter-mile residents within a half-mile Penn Station and Hudson Yards that might also need and might benefit from the service going north. I would just say, too, from a planning perspective, some of us have talked about this in the past in the office about what a fantastically lucky thing it is to be working on this project. It's not often that, especially in a city the size of New York, that you are given an opportunity to do planning around new service without any of the headache of figuring out how to get up the real estate to build the rail lines and where the rail lines are going to go. They're there. and without having to coax the Regional Transit Authority into considering the stations, because they've now agreed that they should be a priority. So it's a really unique study, and it's one that obviously we are keeping an eye on the MTA's budget, but we hope continues to move forward, but we still think it's important to do the planning for now. Just a quick note, I'll just swoop down here. As it comes through, there are actually no current planned stops in Queens. So it'll swoop through Queens, through Astoria, and then Long Island City, and then it'll run under Manhattan to Penn Station. There has been talk of adding a station in Long Island City. If you're not familiar with Long Island City, it's, despite its name, it's not a separate city. It's just a neighborhood in Queens. It's essentially downtown Queens. And there is a lot of logic to adding a station there as well. The working with the MTA obviously is a really important part of this. I apologize if this is a little cartoony. These are some slides we had put together for the creation of a little explanatory video that will go up on our website within the coming days here. So I just grabbed a couple of those slides. So the MTA will build the stations. The head of capital construction for MTA, Eve Michelle, who I've been in many meetings with, I've never been in a meeting where she hasn't pointed out that the MTA's project is 15 miles long and 100 feet wide. And by that, she means that in order to get it done, the MTA really just has to focus on any track work, repairs and whatnot that they need to do. There are a couple places where they'll need to add a fourth track so that Acela trains can bypass the local service Metro North trains. But they've really got to focus on that to get it done, and they've got to focus on the stations. But they've been working with us, and we've been working together, because this is obviously, these are two very complementary things, to do all the planning work around the stations. I would just say, I'll give a little bit of overview of the stations later, but there is not a single one of these stations, with the exception of potentially Hunts Point, where you could imagine the projected 5,000 to 6,000 passengers a day comfortably getting on and off the stations. There are a lot of issues around sidewalks and that sort of thing, basic pedestrian safety stuff, but we also think there are opportunities to add housing and jobs around those stations. So just a note on how quickly the world can change, as I think we're all very well aware this year. On the left is a headline from January of this year, when the MTA announced their biggest ever capital budget, $51.5 billion. They came out very hot and heavy, ready to do a lot of track improvement work and station improvement work, but also fully dedicated funds for a lot of large projects, including Metro North, including the extension of the 2nd Avenue subway from 96th Street, to which it was extended just at the very end of 2016, all the way up to Harlem 125th Street. So that's how the year started. Flash forward several months, and obviously the headlines are much different. The MTA is currently, my understanding, losing about $200 million a week. It's pretty rough. The subways have come back to life a little bit, but they're still pretty empty. I think most people are being very cautious in avoiding them, or the reality is there have been a lot of lost jobs, and a lot of people are working from home as well. So things can change. That said, we do work closely with the MTA, and the MTA assures us that this remains a priority for them. They understand the budget concerns. They're hoping for a stimulus package coming up. We'll see, but we think it's important that we still do the planning work. The time constants over which planning work happens can be very long. And so, even if there is a delay on these stations, we think that there's value in getting the planning thinking down so that there's something that can serve as a roadmap for the community in the future. Okay, so just really quickly, and as sort of a case-making point for making sure this service does come to the East Bronx, I pulled here the City of Chicago's definition of equitable TOD, which I very much like, which is development that enables all people, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, age, gender, immigration status, or ability, to experience the benefits of dense, mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented development near transit hubs. I think this is just an important point in general, but it especially resonates with the Bronx, which again is a much poorer community than most of New York, frequently misses out. Brooklyn has its kind of downtown, Queens has Long Island City, Manhattan, of course, has many centers of its own that are dense and pedestrian oriented. The Bronx doesn't really have much of a center to speak of. It kind of has the hub in the South Bronx. And this is something we heard a lot from people, that they expressed a desire to have a place that feels like more of a place and more of a happening place without having to go into Manhattan to do it, but also just to have access to that transit. And I would also point out that something like 2/3 of Bronxites using the service are actually projected to be using it to go north, to job centers north. And so it's especially critical for that and that connectivity, giving people an option other than their personal automobile, which unfortunately is really the option for a lot of people going up to places like New Rochelle or other job centers that, you know, can't necessarily make it over to the West Bronx every day to catch a station or a train there. So obviously the study touches on a lot of things: parks and open space, pedestrian safety, circulation, housing, jobs, and a number of other things. These are all embedded in the thinking. They're reflected in the agencies we work with, and so forth. So speaking of agencies we work with, the study itself is being led by the Department of City Planning, the Bronx office, but we have been collaborating closely, and we really consider core partners on the study the New York City Department of Transportation, and really especially the Bronx office of that agency, and the New York City Economic Development Corporation, which is a quasi-governmental agency in the city that does a lot with real estate and economic development. And given the economic development lens on this, the deputy mayor felt it very important that we all be working together, which makes a lot of sense. But of course, we've been consulting with a number of agencies, both state, such as the MTA, and also other city agencies. Housing Preservation Development is critical, Parks and Recreation, Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, Small Business Services, and then many others that touch on things like schools, immigrant affairs, libraries, and that sort of thing. So I'm just gonna, maybe I'll pause there before I go through the stations, see if anyone has any questions. Okay, great. I might be moving through this a little more quickly than I thought, so I think that's okay. So the station locations, there are 4 stations again that would be added. The southernmost station, Hunts Point, then Parkchester Van Nest, Morris Park, and then Co-op City. Co-op City being very close, not quite at, but very close to the boundary, the northern boundary of the city of New York, where it meets Westchester County. So this image, which I had included as the sort of teaser image, was put together by one of our urban designers. I think I just like it because it shows the very unique character of each of these. And here we have some things pulled out just to kind of give you a sense of that. Hunts Point, you've got the markets, you've got Oneida Street, which recently was designated as a historic district. You also have the subway connection at the 6 train. Parkchester is its own unique community that I'll talk about a little bit more. The sketches there are some of the very charming terracotta figures that are spread throughout Parkchester. We have the job center at Morris Park, and then we have a very large population center and coincidentally also a naturally occurring retirement community at Co-op City at the far northern extreme. So I'll go south to north. So we'll start as though we just came from Penn Station. So we arrive at Hunts Point. What is Hunts Point? Hunts Point is a community of 50,000 residents within a half-mile of the station. It's the only station with a convenient connection to the subway. And it's adjacent to 2 other city planning study areas, which is an important point just because it has informed how we've had those discussions so we could avoid planning fatigue. We had an ongoing Southern Boulevard neighborhood study, and then EDC had their own, EDC, which is responsible for the Hunts Point markets, had their own Hunts Point vision planning work. So we didn't want to exhaust the community. Just we kept things very focused here. There are some issues here, particularly the platform location was something we were very concerned about. We've been working with the MTA to get what we think is a better condition and understand how we can get that. Pedestrian safety is a real issue in this area. There are a lot of large trucks that come through, other conditions. Pedestrian connectivity under the Bruckner Expressway, which you'll be able to see better in the next image, is also a concern just because it's both feels unsafe and is unsafe both from a personal safety and a traffic standpoint. Just really quickly, that really beautiful bridge that you see there in the background with the kind of the red bracing is the Hellgate Bridge, and that is the bridge that these new trains will run across as they go into Queens and then swing under Manhattan to Penn Station. That was actually, if it looks familiar, it's because it's the same engineer who designed the famous bridge in Sydney. I believe he did this one first. So just quickly, I just marked up a quick image here of Hunts Point, kind of help orient you. North is kind of in the lower right-hand corner here. So the Hunts Point markets, you can kind of see on the left of the screen. These are fish markets There's a fish market, there's a meat market, and there's a produce market. They're massive. We've been in all three of them on tours. They're very important to the provision of food to the city, especially to restaurants in the city. And also there's just a lot of general wholesale work that comes out of it. The station, you can see, kind of lands right this kind of dense little neighborhood node within the Hunts Point Peninsula. And then outside of the Hunts Point Peninsula, which is cut off by the Bruckner, is the kind of the Southern Boulevard Longwood neighborhood. The Southern Boulevard neighborhood study kind of came right around to this area, as well as the subway connection at Del Valle Square. So just a little bit of planning history. I said Robert Moses's fingerprints were all over the city. Here is one of them, the Bruckner. It's a pretty gross condition. When you go from where the station entrance will be over to the square, you're passing under that condition. There has been some work with the state to improve and get rid of some of the on and off ramps, so that will be improved in the coming years. But it's still something we're very concerned about and have been working with DOT and others to understand how we get a better condition under there. Go north to the next station, which is Parkchester Van Nest. Parkchester is home to some 67,000 residents within a half mile. It also has 3 large redevelopment sites. It's sort of unique among them, in which there are consolidated lots of property with an interest in doing something transit oriented. So it's just something that has made this a unique station and has presented unique opportunities. It has a number of issues. Principal among them is East Tremont Avenue, which I'll show you in the next image, which runs by the station, is really, really poor pedestrian condition. It technically has sidewalks on the north side where people would be getting off, but they're overgrown with weeds in the summer. There are disputes about maintenance of them. It's something we just want to resolve and want to build out a wide sidewalk so people are comfortable walking around, among other things. And it has limited accessibility from the post station to the neighborhoods to the north of the rail line. And so just to kind of orient you here, maybe I hope this isn't too confusing, south is now the top of the screen. And you can see the station there on Tremont Avenue. Tremont Avenue is the street that runs along here. This large thing in the middle that I've labeled Parkchester, a lot of people misidentify it as a New York City Housing Authority campus. It's not. This is the Parkchester Special Plan Community Preservation District. It was built by the MetLife Corporation, essentially as an investment, and finished in 1941. It was really a middle-class housing development. It has 12,000 units. About half of those are ownership and about half of them are rentals. This is the same developer, MetLife, by the way, that built Stuytown in Manhattan, if you're familiar with Stuytown, another master plan community. So that is accounting for a lot of that 67,000. I believe 30 to the 67,000 is coming from this development alone. I believe the population is slipped a little closer to 30 as the population has aged. This is also a naturally occurring retirement community within the city. Coincidentally, it's also credited with the early demise of the West Bronx, as a lot of mobile middle-class residents of the West Bronx moved to the East Bronx to live here. That's also a story with Co-op City that we hear a lot. And then I just wanted to point out Robert Moses again. You can see the Cross Bronx Trench that runs through. So if you've read The Power Broker, you're very familiar with this chapter 1 Mile, which is about that heartbreaking fight to keep that from being built. Oops. Okay, go away. Apologize. Make that guy go away. Anyway, okay. So moving on. Oh, and just really quickly, I mentioned potential development sites. This site is under consolidated ownership. It's obviously very close to the station. That team is interested in doing something oriented towards the station. There are some other large sites that want to do something transit oriented that are thinking about real benefits for the community, such as community centers and park space and additional connections to the train. Okay, I'll go on here. Can anyone hear me? Okay, sorry, my computer seemed to have froze for a sec. Is everyone still with me? Can at least one person let me know?
We're here.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so the next station is Morris Park. Morris Park is unique in its own way. It does have some 30,000 residents within a half mile, but it's really a job center. It's in fact one of the 10 largest job centers in the city. Most people don't realize that, and it's by far the largest job center in the Bronx, at least 20,000 jobs. There are 300 plus medical offices in the immediate area, some 3,000 students, postdoctoral fellows. It has some issues, constrained transportation network, which has been an issue for years and has been a drag on growth. It has very poor pedestrian conditions around the station. It has a lack of connectivity to large institutional campuses in the area, and there's a real lack of open space in the area. So just kind of to lay it out here, I just labeled some of the medical campuses. You can see the station kind of lands in the middle here. We've got Jacoby, which is part of the city's health and hospital system, which was really critical in the COVID response early on. You've got Montefiore Einstein. This is sort of their cancer center and then their main campus. They're a major private hospital in the city. And then you have the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. These are the housing towers for that school and some of their buildings, which is a very competitive school. It does a lot of high-end genomic research, and it's thinking about, as all these institutions are, what the station means for them. You also have a number of other institutions, Calvary Hospital, you have the Bronx Psychiatric Center, you have the former Bronx Psychiatric Center, which had been RFP'd out by the state, and there's a plan for 1.1 million to 1.9 million square feet of additional commercial and office development there. So there's a lot happening around the station. You have Mercy College over here. This weird Borg cube type building to the north is the Public Safety Answering Center, which is a 911 center. It's the second public safety answering center. Excuse me, take a drink of water. In the city is very important. The other one is in the Metrotech Center in Brooklyn. But there are some issues here. There is really not a great pedestrian condition as you get close to the station. There's a lot of automotive uses that illegally park up on Bassett Avenue on this side. There's a camper that's been parked there since the first time I saw this area 4 years ago. It's never moved once. So there are some basic issues there. And then on the other side, there's just a lot of private property. There's actually no public property until you get to Marconi here. And so we've been working with the private property owners to understand how we can get improvements together with the MTA for things like open space and better pedestrian conditions and that. There's actually quite a bit here, and I unfortunately can't go into it in a lot of detail, but I'm happy to answer questions to the extent that I can if any come up. I'll keep moving here. And then the final station is Co-op City. Co-op City is short for Cooperative Housing City. This is, I don't know how unique this is to New York, but it's certainly something I wasn't familiar with before I moved to New York. A cooperative housing development is different from a condo in that when you buy a unit, you are not actually buying the physical unit, you are buying shares that are proportional to the size of your unit. And if that's not confusing, I hope it's not. It's a little confusing even now, but essentially what that means is you own the shares. You can sell the shares, but you can't sell the physical unit when you move out. You obviously vacate the unit when you sell the shares. What it means is that this kind of housing tends to remain a lot more affordable than condos, for instance, and my understanding, about 75% of for-sale properties in the city of New York are cooperative housing. So the prices tend to be more stable. The downside is that obviously you can't make a big profit, if you were to live in it for 20 years and want to turn around and sell it, because it's much more tampered than a market rate unit would be. Anyway, Co-op City is the world's largest cooperative housing development, is my understanding. There are 50,000 residents in Co-op City. It's also a naturally occurring retirement community. It has very limited mass transit access today. And the community here is really heavily reliant on buses. Platform location was a primary concern for us here. Bus connectivity, given the need to connect people to and from the large development, and connectivity from Co-op City and the station area in general. There are just some really basic improvements that need to be made. So here we just have a quick aerial. South is kind of on the right-hand side of the screen here. So you can see the station is at the far southern extreme of what is Co-op City. Just a funny note, this is so far out at the edge of the city that it just happens to be right here that Google Earth stops having 3D geometry. So you get it here, you don't get it here, but this is actually quite tall here. This is section 5 of Co-op City. This is a giant mall, unfortunately, and then you have the remaining sections of Co-op City here. Again, imprint of Robert Moses can also be seen at this station. Just a quick note, because Robert Moses is frequently derided, I think it's important, he did a lot of good things with parks in the city. One park that I currently live by now, Jackie Robinson, is wonderful park with pools and stuff. So it's not all bad. And one of the things he did that wasn't all bad is Orchard Beach, which you see here, which he built out to be the French Riviera of the Bronx, as he called it. And then also just to give you a sense of the really amazing geographic variety of the Bronx and New York City in general, this kind of flattened shape that you're seeing here is called City Island, which is truly an island. It's just connected with a bridge, which is essentially a New England fishing village within the borough of the Bronx. It's a wonderful place. It has a lot of seafood restaurants that are a big draw, but it's a very different pace of life once you get out on that island. And you have these large park spaces, Pelham Bay Park to the south, and so forth. That is all to say the stations are very diverse. And because the stations are very diverse and they're spread out over quite a bit of geography, the public approach to this has not been singular, but has been on a station-by-station approach. So we have, as we've held events, we've gone to each of the communities individually. Co-op City, we held the event in their public space that they have there for us, their community center. Same with Morris Park, we held it in one of the hospitals there. Parkchester, similar, in a school right next to Parkchester Development, Hunts Point, and the Point, which is a community center, an arts center in the Hunts Point Peninsula. So we held a series of public open houses and workshops. We've been quite a few points of engagement. We've held engagement with community boards. Again, community boards have an advisory role. They are an important part of the ULURP process, but also the planning process in general. And they do have a lot of expertise about community needs. They are the ones, again, putting together the community board budget requests. And they have just a very good grasp on what the community needs. We've met with numerous neighborhood organizations. We've obviously been meeting with elected officials, council members, or other elected officials, whether they be local or national or state. I would say that with this study, a lot of neighborhood planning studies, I suppose everywhere, can be rather contentious. We haven't really seen that with this study, and I think we've benefited from both the excitement of just the new stations and just the logic of anyone that knows the stations are coming and that is familiar with these areas understand that there is some planning that has to happen to make the stations work. In the West Bronx, where there are existing Metro North stations, unfortunately, things weren't always done right, and they tend to fade away in the community and not always be comfortable or safe to access, especially at different times of the day. And so people very much get the need to do these ones right in this unique opportunity. Coming out of the process, so last year we had a big sort of interim public open house. We've been working over the course of the last year with different stakeholders to take what we heard there, also to continue our work with the capital agencies to understand how we can advance some of the suggestions that came out of that work and to kind of update our recommendations. So we've sort of grouped these in three big categories. We have placemaking and land use, jobs and economic development, and transportation and circulation. This touches on, placemaking. Land use is a little amorphous as a title, but touches on everything from equitable transit access to housing, to parks and open space, to community resources and health, and stationary and access. And really by that, we mean the work with the MTA. Jobs and economic development is important. We want to make sure that we're working to grow the job center in the Bronx. We think the Bronx deserves that. We want to make sure we're connecting Bronxites to jobs in the borough, but also in the region. Again, a lot of Bronxites are projected to be taking this to go to job centers north. And then really job preparedness, working with city agencies such as small business services, such as workforce development, to make sure that we're thinking about the pipeline of how Bronxites can work their way into positions in these job centers, both in the city and through the region. And that will, I will say, be an increasingly important role as we come out of the financial devastation that the pandemic has wrought. And then finally, transportation and circulation. Obviously pedestrian and cyclist safety is very important here, and thinking through that. Transportation connections in general, we've got a little bit of everything. We have the subway at Hunts Point. We actually have a relatively nearby New York City ferry connection at Parkchester. Parkchester, we have buses and that sort of thing. And then just being realistic that vehicular circulation is something we have to think about. It's important in the East Bronx that we address it. We can't just avoid it. So I just wanted to share with you, mostly to give you a sense of kind of how we display some of what we do and some of our thinking, so it's not, always text. I'm just going to share a couple of images that we shared publicly last spring that started to bring to life some of what we had heard in the preceding year during public outreach events. And so this is just a sketch that one of our urban designers had put together showing kind of transformed East Tremont Avenue. So in the back, you've got Parkchester here with the Metropolitan Oval fountain kind of there. And kind of showing, where the moves are. So this is that large empty block. Maybe we get something here that's close to the station. Maybe it's appropriate. It's a little bit denser, something more contextual, pushing up against these, lower walk-up buildings on that side. Really kind of thinking it through. This diagram itself is really more about circulation and kind of how we hold the corners. But just to give you a taste for how we start to tell the story with images at the Department of City Planning. And here's an image, again, that we shared publicly last spring for Morris Park, thinking through that job center and how that job center might develop. I think these are also important to get out to the public. The public, I will say, reacted very well to these. But I think it's also here where, really pushing the need for the transit-oriented development and showing a lot of constraint in the extent of the rezoning. And so making it clear that we're not here to, just rezone everything, but we want to keep it pretty focused. What are the key corridors? What are the key pedestrian points and key access points to and from the station? And where are there opportunities for life sciences, which have a very particular footprint? Where might those fit and that sort of thing? So this is kind of telling that story. I'm going to draw your attention to the little triangle here, which is a little faded, because this is actually kind of an interesting thing and a really good thing that came out of the public process. Very early on in the public process, almost immediately, I would say, we started to hear a desire in Morris Park for some kind of public open space here. While there are some green spaces on the medical campuses here, they're not really public. They don't feel public. And, as people were thinking about coming into and from the train, maybe whether they were workers or they were people who would come for services here, or maybe even residents, there was a desire that there might be some place to wait that's closer to the train, that feels like they have a right to be there and that sort of thing. And so that has evolved over the course of the last couple of years into this idea of a gateway plaza at Morris Park. This was an early sketch that one of our designers put together, just kind of laying out how this might work. This is, I would also note, a station where pedestrians will actually be able to traverse the bridge even if they're not using the station and get to the other side, which is a big improvement. Today, that's at least a 20-minute walk down and around, so that will cut down significantly. So this has involved a lot of coordination with city agencies, with the MTA, with local institutions. For instance, these are the kind of fun sort of planning challenges that come up that you don't always anticipate. Or so in this case, DOT very much liked the idea that there could be sort of a real plaza like this around here, but was concerned about who the maintenance partner might be. That this is always an issue with their plaza spaces. They need maintenance partners. And they've had issues in the past, such as at Fordham Plaza, where the maintenance partners have kind of fallen away. So a lot of our work has been working with the institutions to identify a maintenance partner and that sort of thing. And we've been making good progress in those conversations. It's something that's exciting. We hope in 5 to 10 years, someone stepping off the train will have this really nice pedestrian experience there. And it, again, this is something that we essentially got from the public. We helped to develop further with city agencies. We shared back with the public, and it was very, very well received. And then just continuing, the theme of how we show things. Obviously, as planners, we're very used to looking at, top-down maps, and even axonometrics are, a lot of people are comfortable with them, but a lot of people aren't necessarily. So something we try to do is we always try to bring it down to the human scale. And so here are a couple of examples of sketches that were put together by some of our designers, just kind of bringing to life a little bit what it would look like with some of the pedestrian improvements, like the crosswalks and the kind of little planted areas and the paved areas, dedicated busways, the addition through zoning allowances for additional retail, some of the buildings that would be allowed, kind of bringing it to life, wayfinding, that sort of thing. We find these are helpful. They're also helpful when we go out publicly and we're getting feedback to have something that is kind of in a language that really people are used to thinking about the environment around them, so they can comment on it and share that with us. I'm running over now. I apologize. I'm going to finish this up really quickly. Here is just a quick sketch, day in the life, another way we kind of bring things to kind of a human perspective. These were very well received as well. They're just little vignettes and stories about how the service might affect people's lives. So ultimately, who is the audience for the plan? This is, again, from the video we put together to explain the plan. It's a little maybe cartoony. Obviously, people and neighbors, community boards and organizations, city agencies, and builders and other private entities would be looking to this as a roadmap for what should or shouldn't be done in the area. So just really quickly, I guess I'll pause there. If we don't have enough time, I can cut this out, Ivy. If we do, I can just go through it really quickly. It's a pretty short section.
We have 15 to 20 minutes, so I think you should go ahead.
Okay, great. So obviously, COVID happened. It hit New York City very hard. To date, there have been 24,000 plus deaths in the city alone. I think 33 or 34 some thousand in the state. A lot of jobs lost, nearly 700,000. Some of those have come back since places begun to open again, but it's still nowhere near where it was. On the right is just a quick snap I took early on in the pandemic. The New York Post has very punny headlines, but this kind of laid out the scene in New York at the beginning of the pandemic. It was quite strange. It's no longer a ghost town, as some people have claimed. But for a while there, it was a quite strange place to be. And I myself been in the city for the entirety of the pandemic and have sort of seen that evolution. So the city had to respond quickly, and that's kind of, I just want to talk about a little bit. And this ended up being kind of an all hands on deck situation. One of the things the city needed to do, understanding that a lot of people were now out of work or were afraid to leave their homes for fear of catching COVID, was the city had to figure out how to make sure New Yorkers were able to eat. And so there was a big food distribution effort. This is an image of National Guard soldiers loading boxes of non-perishable food into a New York City taxi. If you could see out the door, there are lots and lots of taxis waiting to get filled up, or Ubers or whatnot, to go and distribute food. So this was a big effort. So that image was actually taken from inside this building. So this is the Armory in the Kingsbridge Heights section of the Bronx. This is what it sounds like. It's a giant armory with a huge parade ground inside. And I think it's a really good lesson in just, never really knowing what the future will bring and when things might come in handy. There were plans at one point to turn this into a massive indoor market and recreation space. Those fell through, I believe, in the 90s. And then more recently, in the aughts, in the early 2010s, there were plans to turn this into a national ice skating center with multiple rinks and whatnot. That never came through. But what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, when the city was looking around for places that were large enough to serve as sites of operation for food distribution, this was one of the two sites identified in the Bronx. It's massive, empty space. And so it was a really good space to store a lot of food and to have taxis can actually easily wind their way through and loop back out. It's that big of a building. It ended up really serving its purpose. So you never know what's going to happen. So 100 million meals were distributed as part of this process between March and mid-July. I'm sure many more since, although things did begin to slow down in the summer. Staff from all agencies were asked and contributed to this effort. I myself spent several weekends at the Kingsbridge Armory and also at Basketball City. Here you can see my coworker Paul from the zoning division helping work on some of the boxes and get them ready to load up into vehicles. So the city had that immediate reaction. We just had to respond. There was a need, and so city agencies were asked. But then once things slowed down a little bit, our Housing and Economic Development Agency downtown were able to take a more measured approach, and they came up with a study that they wanted to do, which is just to understand the health of the retail corridors, really in the outer boroughs, also in Manhattan, but also just to get a sense of how they were faring throughout the city. So I myself went out to Morris Park Ave in the East Bronx. So this is the same Morris Park Ave as the station name. If you were to follow Morris Park Ave to the east, to the right of the screen over, you would end up at the station after several blocks. Really, we went out, we were open, what was closed, what was vacant, had there been any modifications for COVID, such as hair salons. A lot of them wouldn't let you just walk in and get a haircut. You'd have to call before, and those sorts of things. And also looking at outdoor seating. And I posted a picture here just because I love how modest this was. And, here at Luciana's Pizza, they didn't have the equipment to do fancy outdoor seating, so they just got a folding table and a couple folding chairs. So if people wanted to come and eat pizza, they could do that without having to walk away. At this point, there was still no indoor dining allowed. Now it's been allowed. It looks like it'll be rolled back again as we head into a second wave, but just give you an idea. And then I'll just call this section Open Everything. The city started with open streets. They began to close streets to vehicular traffic or through traffic to varying degrees of success. And then from that, they went into the open restaurants. I think that date is actually wrong. It started much earlier than September. But this allowed, and I'm sure many of you have seen this in your own cities, this has allowed restaurants to expand not only into the sidewalk, but also into the roadbed with more permanent structures there. And that is now a permanent program in New York City. It will be year-round. There's no sunset for it anymore. And then recently, a couple of weeks ago, the city announced the Open Storefronts program, which allows retailers to occupy part of the sidewalk in front of their buildings to display goods and whatnot to help them out. That's set to end at the end of the year, but I wouldn't be surprised if that also got extended. And so here's just a really quick image of what this looks like. This is a great coffee shop in the city, the Hungarian Pastry Shop in Morningside Heights. This is essentially open streets meets open restaurants. This is a weekend shot. So on the weekends, they close this portion of Amsterdam Avenue. And because of that, the Hungarian Pastry Shop and as well some restaurants south of here are able to really expand into the roadbed and between people. And this has actually been a lovely outcome of what happened. And then just a quick shot from Lower Manhattan, where you have the Little Italy area, Mulberry Street, where you have some more formal outdoor seating that is starting to become more and more permanent. There now, if you were to go out there, there are a lot of space heaters and enclosings and things like that. Get a sense of that. And then people are getting, there should be a question mark here, a bit of innovative dystopia. You're starting to get these bubbles. I question the effectiveness of these as if you're closing people together in a little bubble, but at least they're not around other people, I guess. This is on the Upper West Side. Finally, I wanted to end on this image of the Chess Forum. One, because it's one of my favorite places in the city of New York, which is a chess shop slash place where you can go and just play chess, but also because it might help to explain a little bit the esoteric title that I gave this presentation. So on the day that I owed Michael the title for this presentation, I was actually in this area that afternoon and wandered over just to make sure that the Chess Forum was still open and had not closed, as have unfortunately a number of businesses throughout the city. I was very happy to see it was open and it was thriving. And when I walked in, I also noticed T.S. Eliot poem on the wall that ends with the line, where you are is where you are not. And it's essentially a poem about the turbulence of like how you get from where you want to be and not really knowing your way. And I thought it was pretty appropriate for a conversation about planning where, we spend a lot of our time thinking about things that aren't there yet and trying to figure out how to get there. So I thought I would just end on that. That's all I had. I apologize for going a lot over, but I hope that was informative.
Yeah, it is. It's so many exciting things happening in New York City. And thank you so much, Michael. I imagine you can come back to Teams and you can start to moderate the questions and discussion here.
Yes. Yeah, I'll sharing here.
Right, and I want to share, I think, even if Michael Lewis, the host of this Teams meeting, leaves, we can still stay here and continue the discussion. So I don't want you to feel constrained by the timing. We want to continue the discussion as much as we'd like. And just to get things started, Caroline actually posed a question in the chat and raised her hand. And take it from here, Michael.
Hi, Michael. It's Carolyn. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad this worked out. I would definitely say you have found your way. I think what's a little overwhelming is not working for one large city, but for almost like 4 out of all the boroughs. That's how it feels to me. I was curious in looking at the density and when you talked about the fish and meat markets, are you addressing access to healthy food as part of your planning? Because that seems even more critical given COVID, but it was important before. So I'd appreciate hearing that. So thanks again.
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question, especially in the Bronx, which is a borough that doesn't always have access to healthy food, especially depending on where you are in the borough. It is something we address. It is embedded in our recommendations. We work a lot on that with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, but we also have some tools in kind of our zoning toolkit. We have a program called the Fresh Program, for instance, which is essentially a zoning bonus for the provision of grocery stores that provide fresh, healthy foods and that sort of thing. So sometimes we expand the boundaries of those sorts of things to meet needs as needed. I will say the East Bronx is a little unique in that it doesn't necessarily have the issues to the same level of intensity as the West Bronx does. Morris Park, for instance, tends to be, for the Bronx in particular, a wealthier community, although Hunts Point is certainly a community where that's something we've been thinking about more actively. Around Parkchester, I will say there are also a number of community organizations doing a lot of good work. There's a woman, Nilka Martell, over there that I works with a Huntington Free Library, and they've been setting up in a local store, essentially a fridge that people in need can access fresh produce, fruit, vegetables, that sort of thing. So we try to work to the extent that we can. Obviously, we can't require a developer to come in and build a healthy grocery store, but we do push these conversations with those teams. We try to use.
Do they have like any gardens or community gardens or rooftop gardens? Is that part of it as well?
Yeah, there are a number of gardens around the city. Parkchester in particular have a couple in close proximity. The West Bronx is much more replete with gardens, and I would include Hunts Point in that, because Hunts Point, although it's kind of the East Bronx, it's really more in character with the South Bronx, and it just was too complicated to say all the time South Bronx and East Bronx, so we've just been saying East Bronx. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And Michael, I'm not sure if you are familiar with Teams. You can see the hands if you have the participants here. And there is also a question in the chat. So
Sure.
I guess you can go back and forth.
Okay, so I'll just start at the top, I guess, with Sydney.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. You talked a lot about diversity in the Bronx and public input. Would you say that the public input was fair transect of the population, or are there like, I mean, I'm a planner in Madison, which is much smaller, and
Sure.
A lot of our public input, it's the same people showing up all the time, and just wondering how your public engagement process goes, if it's different for specific projects, and if you think that it was successful getting a wide range of people involved.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's certainly something we work at, and it's not always perfect. So again, the stations are all very different, so I'll just go through them one at a time. Co-op City is very unique in that it has a very active older population. So that is a community where it was actually quite easy. We worked with the ownership of Co-op City. We were able to use their community space, and we had hundreds of people. It was an amazing turnout. And so we got a very representative cross-section of the population there. Morris Park is unique in that it has a lot of sort of transient medical workers that are there for the day, or people that are coming in for doctor's appointments. We worked very closely with the institutions to advertise for the event. And I would say we got quite a representative cross-section of medical workers, people that were just there maybe for the day and they found out about it, residents in the community, because there are some residents in the nearby community, and so forth. Parkchester, similarly, Parkchester itself is a very large community. They did a very good job of blasting out information about the event. I will say that one area that was a little frustrating for us at Parkchester is we really were trying to engage more the Bengali population that's in that area, and that has been growing, and that's really centered around Starling Avenue, just to the east of the development. And the reality is we didn't have a lot of luck. We didn't have a lot of success with that could have been very much a language thing. Unfortunately, we don't have on staff. And we did go out to those businesses, though, and try to engage them to the extent possible, one at a time, actually. A coworker and I, days before each of the events, knock on each business's door and trying to get them out. But that was one where we need to work a little bit better in engaging them, certainly. Then at Hunts Point, and I would say generally we had a very good turnout from the other communities around Parkchester, especially Van Nest, which is just to the north. We had the Van Nest Neighborhood Association, which is a very active group, which was able to drum up interest in the event for us and get people out there. Hunts Point also, I would say we had very good turnout. Hunts Point is unique too in that it's in a portion of the Bronx where we have a much larger Spanish-speaking population. It's most present there. And so we do always have materials in Spanish. We have Spanish-speaking staff on hand always to help out with that. This is something we see throughout, and I think maybe there are a lot of reasons for it. We never get quite as many Spanish speakers as we expect to get, and we always really prepare for it. And that's something we've been trying to figure out. And kind of to round out my answer to your question, Sydney, something we're trying to do now, and that we're taking COVID as an opportunity to do better, is that outreach. So we've been working on setting up an online open house that should be going live at the beginning of January 2021. Sort of the video I referenced would be part of that. And for that, I think the advantage we're going to have is that people have their lives, they have their work schedules and that sort of thing, especially with COVID. We think having an online open house that will be active over the course of a few months will give more people an opportunity. We'll also be doing Zoom sessions as part of that. Those Zoom sessions will be in at least Spanish and English for those who want to have the choice between them, and so they feel comfortable coming to the events. And we'll also have our sort of explanatory videos. So we're actually doing the audio recording of the Spanish version right now. A coworker of mine, Fernando, is working on that, and we'll put that together and hopefully have that up online together with the English version soon. We'll have our survey up online and that sort of thing. So we've been working at it. It's not perfect. It's always a bit of a challenge, but we're optimistic that we'll get even more representative of group in the future, although I think it's been pretty representative for most of the stations in the past.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So I will call on Kirk.
Yes, Mike, thank you so very much for the excellent presentation. It's greatly appreciated. And I'm particularly interested in New York, having been born in Harlem and having people in Queens and Corona particularly. I have a question. Given New York's history of rent control, as well as its history of co-ops, and I know Mayor de Blasio has had some interest in affordable housing, there always is a tension in doing TOD development in terms of gentrification and the implications that has. How has that manifested itself in your mitigation strategies? Sure. And what does that look like? Is that as much of a problem given the history of New York and paying a little bit more attention to these issues about housing than most municipalities do? Has that kind of played itself out in a way that has mitigated the gentrification questions, or are you still experiencing a lot of issues?
These are really good questions. I'll try to go one at a time, and I apologize that I missed one. It's also really good to hear your voice again, Kirk. So I'll go through these. So the first answer I will give is in terms of how we mitigate. So we work closely with the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. So although the creation of new housing that is affordable at certain levels, and there's certainly a very lively public debate about what is truly affordable. Separate and apart from that, there are in New York City, especially in these older neighborhoods, a lot of units that are already rent regulated in some fashion. A very large portion of New York City's housing has some form of rent regulation on it. This can range from rent control, which is the older form, to rent stabilization, which is the more common, which essentially means that the unit you're in, the increase in rent is dictated by the rent control board. So some years that can be 0, sometimes it can be 1%, sometimes 2%. It's at their discretion. And that's where we hear a lot of the concern, in particular, over landlords that begin to essentially harass tenants as an area begins to become attractive for different reasons, whether it's a new investment of some kind or for other reasons. And HPD, in those cases, they will expend extra resources, frequently in coordination with a study, to get out ahead of it and make sure people aren't being harassed and landlords aren't using those tactics to push residents out of units. It's certainly an issue that we hear a lot about. I will say in Metro North, it's been a little bit different because of the character of the communities. I would say Morris Park and Co-op City, we've heard very little concern for that. Co-op City is largely ownership. Morris Park, in fact, we've heard the opposite. We've heard a lot of desire for additional housing. There's not much housing at all. And so maybe people that work there don't have options to live close. And if they do, they can't afford it because actually the eastern extreme of Morris Park can be quite expensive. Parkchester, we have heard concerns, certainly around the Parkchester community. There, it's a little different in that we heard a lot about owners in Parkchester getting cold calls to essentially sell their units for cash and feeling like they were being harassed. And so we certainly made sure that HPD was aware of that. And we want to be sensitive to that. Hunts Point is the one where that would be the biggest concern of the 4 stations. It's certainly the one where it would be most present. Kirk, I feel like I lost a question or two in there.
It's a very complex question, but I think you did, thank you for your response. I think you did answer some of the emerging questions, because and I guess my biggest issue was that my question embedded in my question is, but do you think, relatively speaking, New York is doing better than many other municipalities where these strategies around rent control, rent regulation, and co-ops and the like aren't historically present? I guess, and wondering, relatively speaking, do you think, and it's a hard way because no place is like New York, right? So it's hard to compare. But I was just kind of wondering if you were reflecting on that from a planning perspective. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I have a limited purview of how other cities are doing things, but I have thought about Chicago in this context. I know a lot of cities got rid of their public housing and didn't necessarily replace it in kind or in number. Right. And I think Chicago is an example where there's been a lot of criticism that, again, New York is somewhat unique in that it still has all its public housing. It has units for those 400,000 residents that live in them. That doesn't mean things are perfect. NYCHA has a lot of issues. They have an incredible backlog in capital budget expenses they need. There are frequently New York Times articles about the lack of heat in certain buildings or the deplorable conditions of the roofs on NYCHA buildings. I think they need billions of dollars just in roof repairs across the campuses across the city, and that's something we heard. I would tell it that the city has taken a lot of approaches to try to understand what had been, a wave of the last 20 years of really unprecedented growth that got the city, up to a historic population high of 8.4 million. My understanding has now come back down. How the city was trying to leverage that to get the private market to work for the benefit of affordable housing in the city, and that was really that was the origin of MIH. MIH, how do we take this energy and use it to cross-subsidize some affordable housing in the city? Without getting into too much detail, there are questions about, has that been fully effective? Has it really worked out that way? The truth is a lot of the developments we see in the Bronx, we see as 20 to 30% permanently affordable, but then typically enter into agreements with HPD for the remaining 70%, because otherwise they wouldn't be viable projects. So they're effectively 100% affordable. But then there are questions around the income thresholds. Board 3, for instance, in the Central Bronx is a board where the area median income, or the median income for the board, is something like $24,000. And so, there are challenges. But if the city's relying on the market, that's also a challenge. I will also say that the city has tried some other approaches that include what's known as the NYCHA Next Gen project, which was an attempt to identify opportunities for adding additional housing on underutilized portions of NYCHA campuses, so lots or things like that. There was, that has been met with opposition in its own way. somewhat understandably, there was a project in Harlem that was ran into opposition from the residents last year that felt that the densities that were being shown were too high, they were too tall, the buildings being shown were too tall, and an agreement couldn't be reached, and my understanding is the developer essentially walked away from the project, and so that's the risk of the private market, obviously. But New York City and no city gets the federal funding for public housing that it got in the the 50s, the 60s, and so it makes it difficult to do it otherwise, especially now.
Well, thanks for your response and keep up the great work. And New York City's a hell of a place to do planning, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Michael, there is, actually, first comment from Nancy about her class on great cities. She used to teach it, and JD is teaching it now. That's just a comment and congratulations. And there is a following up question from Karen. I don't know if you want to read it, or Karen, are you here? If you are here, you probably want to ask the question so that Michael doesn't need to find the question. If Karen's not here, Michael, did you find the question?
Yeah, I'm happy to read it.
Okay, awesome.
So Karen asks, you mentioned allowing bump out into the road seating for restaurants without a sunset date. I'm from upstate New York and know that even in New York City, that's going to be chilly. Have you seen any studies about what people are willing to sit outside through and endure? This sounds like a niche question, but I'm also wondering about how Milwaukee restaurants might make it through the next several months. I think it's a really good question. Honestly, this question came up more when I saw that Chicago was also doing this. I lived in Chicago and obviously Milwaukee, and those are very, very cold places. To date, it has gotten a little chilly, and I have seen people sitting out with the space heaters, but you see fewer of them. I am also myself curious how long people would continue to sit outside at those places. Yeah, I don't know of any studies that have been done for thresholds. I will say New York isn't quite as cold as Milwaukee and Chicago and some other places. The winters here, at least if you're coming from a Chicago or Milwaukee, are not ultimately all that bad, but we certainly get snow and pretty nasty weather. So I think it's a great question. I don't have an answer, unfortunately, for it.
Are there any other questions?
Oh, thank you, Tim, very much.
If not, I imagine we can still get in contact with Michael after the presentation, after today.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I never put up the last slide. I'm just going to share that real quick. It has my email and my information, and you should feel free to reach out to me directly. And also, if you happen to be in New York City and I'm available, I always love meeting up with people and talking planning, so you should feel free to reach out to me and let me know.
And there is one function I really like Zoom, but I didn't find it in Teams. That's the applause. Let's give Michael applause, virtual applause. Thank you so much. This is wonderful.
Thank you, Ivy, and thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
And again, we can hang out here, even if Michael Lewis leaves. And I guess you probably want to catch up with some of your friends.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll sit on if anyone wants to chat. I'm happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Ivy.